World leaders are in New York for the annual meeting of the UN's General Assembly. They're hoping to tackle some of our most pressing problems. But their critics argue the UN is failing in its mission. So what's the point of the 70-year-old organisation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, every September, leaders of the 193 member states of the UN gather in New York. It's an opportunity to set out their agenda for the upcoming session of the General Assembly. And there's a lot to do this year, including finding a replacement for the outgoing Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. And as the war in Syria grinds on towards its 6th year, the UN stands accused by many of failing in its primary responsibility of preventing conflict and protecting civilians. Well, that conflict, along with Europe's worst refugee crisis since the Second World War, as well as climate change, will take centre stage. Although the UN has had many achievements since it was formed in 1945, it does have its share of critics who accuse it of being too big for its own good, corrupt and in desperate need of reform. Well, the critics say the UN only acts in the interests of certain powerful nations and that the 5 countries with Security Council veto power have an unfair amount of control over the UN agenda. Some developing nations argue they don't have enough representation at the UN and that their problems go unresolved as a result. And while allegedly ignoring some problems, the UN is accused of making others even worse. Some UN peacekeepers have been accused of abusing people in the communities they were meant to protect. OK, there's a lot to talk about, so let's introduce our panel. In New York, we have Carne Ross, a former British diplomat and founder of the Independent Diplomat, a non-profit advisory group. In Edinburgh, in Scotland, we have Peter Anthony Gallo, a former UN investigator who worked in the Office of Internal Oversight Services. In London, we have Natalie Samarasinghe, the Executive Director of the United Nations Association, which is a UN watchdog. Welcome to you all. Can I start by asking you, Carne, do we need the UN? The UN seems to be failing on so many essential measures. Do we need it?
No, of course we do. You need somewhere for the countries, the member states of the UN to talk, as they are this week. I mean, it's an affirmation of the value of the UN that 193 world leaders are coming here this week. But just to give one example why it's necessary, the Paris Treaty passed last December to limit carbon emissions. That's an extraordinary step forward, albeit not enough, but nevertheless a very, very positive step forward in the global response to climate change. So by that measure alone, the UN clearly has some value despite its many failings.
Peter, can I put to you the words of Dag Hammarskjöld, of course the second Secretary-General. He said the UN was created not to lead mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Has the UN achieved that?
The problem is you're going to get a different answer depending on who you ask. And unfortunately, in many cases, if we ask the people who are dependent on the UN for their protection, and basically for their livelihood and for their lives, in too many cases, the answer to that is no, that it isn't. The UN is operating missions around the world, and we're having too many complaints of sexual abuse cases and other exploitation of the population who they are there to protect and serve.
And to you, Natalie, now you're a supporter of the UN and its principles, the principles that it espouses. But where would you say it's gone wrong? Because clearly the criticism hasn't come from anywhere. The people in Syria would not agree that the UN is fulfilling its mission.
Absolutely. I mean, UNA UK's role is to be a UN watchdog. So we are supportive, but we are not uncritically supportive. We're a critical friend. I think what we have to remember is that the UN is not divorced from politics. It is an organization of member states, so it's only really ever going to do what member states let it do. They're the ones who call the shots, they fund it, they decide what its priorities should be, and sadly too often they fail to agree. So I think we've seen from the UN's history that when the big powers don't agree or when they have particular interests, the UN isn't able to make headway. But on a whole host of issues, from development reform to the Paris Agreement that Carne mentioned, it is able to make headway.
And Carne, is that where the root of the problem lies? Is it in the structure of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, the disproportionate amount of power that's given to 5 permanent members? Is that where the rot starts?
I think it is where the rot starts, because it's the source of inaction, if that's a way of putting it. For instance, over Syria, where the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Council, are horribly divided, and that therefore the Security Council has been unable to agree even basic measures to stop the war, like putting military sanctions on the Assad regime. It's also where the problem starts about appointments in the UN and appointment of the leadership. The Secretariat of the UN, the actual organs of the UN, are deeply problematic. You know, for instance, peacekeeping, as Anthony Gallo mentioned, an awful lot of problems of corruption, ineffectiveness, actual, abuse by peacekeepers. That is a problem of leadership. So we have 2 separate problems, but they are connected. But reform of the Security Council alone will not be enough. The Secretariat itself, the leadership of the UN itself through the Secretary-General, has to be reformed and dramatically improved.
And all right, I'll put that to you then, Peter. What sort of reforms do you think would make a significant improvement to the way the UN operates in the short term? I'm thinking of the size of it. I mean, you've actually worked within the UN system itself. It's enormous, isn't it?
It is, but you're asking a dual question there. There is a very significant difference. When you talk about the UN, do you actually mean the General Assembly of the member states?
I think we're talking about the Secretariat. Yeah, we're talking about the Secretariat now, because Carne has already identified that that's where he would like to see change first.
Indeed, the Secretariat has evolved to be basically a law unto itself, which is exploiting the immunity which was granted to it under the 1946 Convention, so that the Secretariat, the staff of the Secretariat, cannot be sued for any wrongdoing. There is no accountability for actions that they take.
And what sort of examples could you give us? What sort of examples of abuse, taking advantage of their situation, could you give us in brief?
Oh well, the headlines are full of sexual exploitation, rape cases. Now these are egregiously bad. The problem is that where such an allegation is levelled against a UN staff member, they cannot be prosecuted criminally unless and until the United Nations has internally investigated that from an administrative point of view. Someone who's accused of a rape as a UN staff member can spend 3 or 4 or 5 years being investigated and fighting the process internally within the system before the Secretary-General will waive the immunity and basically agree to have that person handed over for prosecution at the local level by criminal law enforcement, by which time it's more often than not, it's far too late to do anything about the criminal offence anyway. And the abuse of the immunity in that regard is basically promoting a culture of impunity.
And Natalie, I've heard that it's almost impossible to get the sack from the UN. I mean, this is something that really needs to be addressed because it is shielding incompetence and even criminal acts.
I think there are 2 issues here, and they're both really to do with leadership and management. I think the first is to do with leadership and cooperation by member states. You know, it sounds boring to say it's states, not the UN, but there is an element of that. I think the single thing that would make the biggest difference to how the UN operates is if states actually put it under pressure to do the right thing and also supported it. But there's clearly an issue internally as well. I think the UN is often much too slow, not just to get an internal process going, but to keep people informed. So even when it is taking steps, it seems like it's not because it doesn't, realize that you need to communicate and be open and transparent. And I think that comes down to leadership and management and changing a culture of responsiveness and fear of being open. And that's why UNA UK has been really part of a push to change how the UN selects its leadership, because that can come from the top in a sort of symbolic sense, but also in a very practical sense, because the UN's chief appoints a whole lot of other heads of agencies and heads of departments. Those appointments have been fiercely political in the past, and we want to open them up and transform them so that the UN can make progress. But I just wanted to challenge, I think, what you said earlier about the UN being enormous. I mean, it has a huge remit, and people often say it's got this big budget, but when you look at it, what it spends every year on everything it does, peacekeeping, development, humanitarian aid, etc.
Yeah, but there are
less than, say, Wall Street bonuses and so on.
But there are so many agencies, Natalie. There are so many agencies. You can't imagine that they're not duplicating each other's work. And I'm looking at the World Tourism Organization. What's that? The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I get that you need an economic commission for Africa, for Latin America. For Europe, really?
I think there's some duplication there, but I think we've got to be careful. People sort of criticize the UN and say, well, why are all these agencies working on women's issues? You can imagine the opposite criticism. Why aren't these agencies taking gender issues into account? I think on development, that's one area where I'd like to see the UN dramatically transformed. I think there are other actors that could do the job, and the UN should focus on capacity building and sort of doing itself out of a job. So I do think that's an area that needs reform. But I'm not sure that, just saying things need to go without looking at what they actually do and whether they're doing something that's needed. It's very easy to sneer at the International Civil Aviation Authority, but then if a plane crashes, that's the organization you're looking to improve standards. So I do think it needs to be done in a systematic way, but I do agree that some reform and an overhaul of that system is needed, because there is some duplication and there isn't a need for the UN to be working on everything. But we have to remember, it's not only UN officials who are trying to guard their jobs, it's countries. Countries like particular agencies, they like hosting them, they like having the top job in some of them. So again, it's a combination of the UN making changes, but states letting them do that as well.
OK, Carne, now the UN stands accused of failing to get to grips with some of the issues of our time. You rightly pointed out an issue that it claims success with, and that is the climate change agreement in Paris. But what about the issue of violence being perpetrated by non-state actors? The UN doesn't seem to have got its head around how to deal with that. And of course, the other main issue of our time is this huge number of people who are on the move around the world, Europe's largest refugee crisis since the Second World War.
Well, two very, very big questions, and you're quite right to point them out as big problems. I don't think the UN has got properly to grips with the issue of non-state actors. Today, something like 80% of the agenda items in front of the UN Security Council, which deals with conflict and peace in the world, involve non-state actors of one kind or other. And my organisation, Independent Diplomat, has strongly advocated for the UN, for the Security Council, to engage in a much more systematic way with non-state actors. For instance, to meet them. Heaven forbid that the Security Council should actually meet these groups, to engage with them, to have a dialogue, to understand better what their political objectives are, rather than treating them very much at arm's length, which is what they do today. In terms of the other problem you mentioned, refugees, there is a summit today, of course, on UN on refugees, but the outcome of it is not expected to be anything other than pretty disappointing. But as Natalie points out, it's easy to point the finger at the UN in this, but this is a problem of member states. The outcome is going to be disappointing because time after time, member states watered down the document during negotiations, in particular when it talked about their own obligations. In a sense, what we're seeing in refugee policy is a retreat into the renationalisation of policy, that countries are resiling from their obligations under the Refugee Convention to take in asylum seekers and others fleeing distress of one kind or other. So it's wrong to blame the UN in this instance. It's right to blame member states for failing in their own obligations to look after refugees.
And Peter, the UN itself often comes in for blistering criticism, doesn't it? But really, the UN is only as strong as its constituent parts. So, as we've been hearing, it's the member states, the 193 countries, that actually empower the UN, or not, as the case may be.
In theory, you're absolutely correct. And at the policy level, that is the thing. The reason there is no peacekeeping mission in Syria is because the member states cannot agree to put one there. And of course, that is different from considering the administration of the peacekeeping missions that you do have and the activities that you do have on the ground. You've got a mission in Haiti. How that mission operates, how it acts, and how it interacts with the population is definitely something which is entirely the remit of the Secretariat.
And why is it still there in Haiti? It's been there for, what, around 10 years. They haven't had violent conflict for some time, but they have had a good dose of cholera that was introduced by UN peacekeepers.
Absolutely, and if you look at the organization's attempts to basically obstinately deny that they were responsible for the cholera outbreak, it's just unconscionable. It's only recently that the organization is actually admitting that the source of the cholera was from the waste management practices and dumping raw sewage from a Nepalese peacekeeping camp into the water supply. The United Nations is accused of being slow in making decisions, so slow in making decisions that they are in fact still doing business with the company that was responsible for dumping the sewage into the water supply.
Okay, Natalie, so we've spent quite a bit of time, haven't we, underlining the failings of the UN. I'm wondering, because you are particularly concentrating on the way a new Secretary-General is selected, I'm wondering how much power does the Secretary-General have in him or herself? We are or were expecting a woman to take the top job next time round at the end of the year. But how much power, how central are the characteristics, the individual characteristics of that person? How much influence can they have?
I think, it's fair to say that the head of the UN is very constrained. We've talked a lot about how it's states that call the shots, but there is something that very important that the UN chief has, and that is a platform. She or he can be the sort of moral voice of the UN, or he can set the tone of the organization and set the organization's agenda. So I think there is something about the Secretary-General being able to use the soft power of the UN. And I would like to see the next Secretary-General be much more involved with mediation efforts, negotiation efforts, and also changing the culture to address some of the deep-seated transparency and corruption and mismanagement issues that we've talked about today. And the Secretary-General can also have a very practical impact. So if you look at, say, Kofi Annan's deal with pharmaceutical companies, which widen access to HIV/AIDS treatment, or the interventions of previous Secretary-Generals such as Dag Hammarskjöld and U Thant, who had a real impact in preventing the Cuban Missile Crisis from escalating and securing hostage releases. So I think on a sort of moral, symbolic, practical, and a sort of management level, the Secretary-General can have a real impact.
And Carne, obviously the UN was set up 70 years ago. It has failed, some people observe, to adjust to the post-Cold War period. And furthermore, the current tensions between China, the United States and Russia, of course, being at quite a frosty relationship between the three of them, and that the UN is not responding, is not able to respond to accommodate or to ameliorate those tensions.
That's absolutely correct. And of course, the usual bromide proposed when this problem is diagnosed is reform of the UN Security Council, in particular, to expand it, to increase the number of permanent members with the veto, or not with the veto, but permanent members.
Would that help?
This is one of the points under debate. But well, it's not going to happen. I mean, this is the problem, is that there is absolutely no progress in agreeing reform for all kinds of boring reasons, but there is no immediate prospect. I mean, this has been discussed for years and years, if not decades. The problem is the permanent members don't want to give up their power, much as they claim that they want reform, and the non-permanent members, the other member states, are not really prepared to put in the aggressive effort to make it happen. I mean, I personally think the tools are in their hands. They can boycott the Security Council in its current form until it is reformed, but they refuse to do that. For some reason, member states don't really care enough.
Well, that's a terrible indictment, isn't it, Peter, that member states don't really care enough to push forward this desperately needed reform in order to make the United Nations a much more effective tool for the international community. I mean, that sounds absolutely terrible.
It does. It's related to the financial questions as to what are countries paying into the United Nations and what are they getting out of it. And what has happened over time is that the smaller countries have, over a progressive number of years, has voted down their own budgets, leaving the United States to take an increasingly heavy share of the burden.
So I understand that the United States pays around 22% of the United Nations budget. That affords it, therefore, rather too much influence, doesn't it? More power.
Well, it doesn't actually give them power if it's still a situation of one country, one vote.
And indeed, they withhold the full remittances anyway, don't they, on a regular basis, in order to increase the amount of leverage that they have within the United Nations. I can see you shaking your head there, Carne.
Well, they haven't done so recently. I mean, the Obama administration has been very pro-UN and has paid up its remittances in full. And Peter was very correct in saying that the US still has one vote. It has the same amount of votes in the General Assembly as a tiny island state in the middle of the Pacific. So the US is, in a sense, not really using its leverage. And I feel that this administration, perversely, whilst being pro-UN, has not used its influence, which is considerable at the UN, to push much more aggressively for reform. Personally, I feel that reform is much easier than countries claim. Everybody throws up their hands and says it's all so difficult, you've got to get everybody to agree, blah, blah, blah. But with a bit of aggression and a bit of courage from diplomats who are not known for these qualities, I think it's possible.
Natalie, so a bit of aggression, a bit of courage, not likely, says Carne. Are you optimistic? Do you think that at any time soon that these much-needed reforms that have already been outlined in long form, 10 years ago there was a report which outlined exactly what needed to be done. Are you optimistic that anything positive will be done with the next Secretary-General?
I think on the question of Security Council reform, no, I agree with Carne. I don't think we're going to make any progress on that anytime soon. But I hope that some elements, at least, of peace operations reform, an overhaul of the development system that we've talked about, and crucially improving the UN's response to mismanagement, corruption and abuse within its own ranks, that we will be able to make headway on that. And those are issues that came up a lot in the sort of dialogues that the General Assembly had with UN Secretary General candidates. So I'm hoping that that pressure will sort of continue. But ultimately, it is going to be states being more aggressive and being more pushy and trying to put the global good ahead of national interest. I think what we've seen in the last few years is a retreat from global responsibility. States have turned inwards, they've been more preoccupied with their domestic constituencies, and they simply can't afford to do that because all the problems we face now really have a global dimension. So I'm hoping that that realization will dawn on states in a much more urgent way than it has today.
All right, can I take the remaining time that we have, which is not much, and ask each of you the same question? Are we better off having the UN or should we scrap it, and why? If you could keep your answers very short, please. Can I start with you, Carne, in New York?
No, I mean, if you didn't have the UN, you'd need to reinvent it. In some sense, it'd be nice to start with a fresh sheet of paper, but that's not going to be possible. And in that situation, I think we have to work with what we've got. New leadership is necessary. I am hopeful that a new Secretary-General will be able to crack the whip a bit more than we've seen hitherto.
And Peter, the same question to you. Are we better off with it or could we do without it?
No, I have to echo what Carne's just said. I think something is better than nothing, and we have something. The fact that we have something does not mean to say that what we've got is good and cannot be improved, because it most certainly can.
And Natalie, I know that you're saying that we're better off with it, even in its flawed state. But do you think that the UN can at least achieve a little bit more?
I think the UN can achieve that with support from powers big and small at the UN and with better leadership, and we will look to the next Secretary-General to provide that. Ultimately, if we didn't have the UN, we would have to invent it. And I'm not sure that many of us have faith in the current set of global leaders to do a better job in creating something that's an improvement on what we have. So we need to focus on making the UN work better.
Thank you all very much indeed. Carne Ross, Peter Gallo, Natalie Samarasinghe, thank you all very much indeed. So it looks as though we're stuck with the UN, aren't we? And thank you for watching. If you want to take part in the conversation, you can go to our Facebook page. That is facebook.com/Inside Story. And there's also the Twitter sphere. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.